The next item of business is debate on motion 19967 in the name of Fiona Hislop on TV licences for the over 75s. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Fiona Hislop to speak to and move the motion. 12 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2015, in funding negotiations as part of the BBC Charter renewal, the UK Government, in a callous and irresponsible act, transferred responsibility to support older people by shifting responsibility on the cost of funding free TV licences for people over 75 years of age directly onto the shoulders of the BBC. This was always about the UK Government cutting funding to the BBC and finding a means for the BBC to take the blame for the UK Government's own cuts. In June this year, the BBC announced that it will scrap free TV licences for over 75s, except to those households with one person receiving pension credit. Means testing eligibility for the concession will result in 3.7 million older people having to pay for their TV licences from June 2020. Access to free television programming for the over 75s with free TV licences was a welcome announcement in 1999 by the then Labour government. Continued by successive governments, free TV licences for over 75s was seen as an important welfare action, enabling older people who frequently spend more time at home to be kept informed and entertained, as well as treating older people with empathy and understanding. The UK Government is playing games with welfare and public service broadcasting. On 26th of August this year, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, and I quote, "The BBC received a settlement that was conditional upon their paying for TV licences for the over 75s. They should cough up," end of quote. Yet now we have a general election looming and Boris Johnson has changed his mind. The Prime Minister is quoted in the Sun newspaper on the 4th of November saying, I quote, "He was working hard to thrash out a solution so that no elderly viewers had to pay." On numerous occasions, the UK Government has stated its disappointment with the BBC's decision, saying how the Government has been clear that it wants and expects the BBC to continue the concession, a concession that the UK Government used to fund from the Department of Work and Pensions grant. So where does the UK Government actually stand on this issue? In the Conservative Party manifesto for 2017, they said, and I quote, "We will maintain all other pension benefits, including free bus passes, eye tests, prescriptions and TV licences for the duration of this Parliament." In 2015, they did not want to continue to pay for free TV licences. In 2017, they said that they would. And in 2019, the Prime Minister said the BBC should cough up for TV licences. The Conservatives are all over the place on this issue and cannot be trusted by pensioners who deserve better. The UK Government should never have foisted responsibility onto the BBC for funding this welfare initiative in the first place. The Scottish Government has repeatedly made our views known on this issue. In July 2015, following the decision, I wrote to the then UK Secretary, John Whittingdale, expressing my disappointment that the decision was made with no consultation with the Scottish Government. Deputy Presiding Officer, as you will be aware, that is a clear breach of the Smith Commission agreement on the BBC. And as recently as the 13th of June this year, my colleague, the Minister for Older People and Equalities, Christina McKelvey, wrote to the UK Government urgently requesting that this be reconsidered. The UK Government has shamelessly pushed welfare policy onto the BBC with scant regard to the consequences. Of course, this is not the first failure of the UK Government to consider the welfare of people across the UK and in Scotland. This year, the Scottish Government has continued to invest over £100 million to mitigate the worst impacts of UK Government welfare reforms. This is part of the £1.4 billion we've spent to support low-income households in 2018-19. And I fundamentally disagree with the UK Government's refusal to support people over 75 to have free TV licences and their refusal to shoulder their responsibility. And I'm not alone in this view. Recent reports from both the House of Commons and the House of Lords committees state that welfare policy is not the responsibility of the BBC. And there have been 2 petitions upholding this view. The UK Government debated the issue on the 15th of July after a petition reached almost 172,000 signatures. But they did not alter their position, and they continued to blame the BBC. On the 1st of August, Age UK handed in their petition to 10 Downing Street, with more than 630,000 people also voicing their disapproval of this policy. Also, interestingly, raising their concerns about the policy is the Office for Budget Responsibility. In July, they published their annual Fiscal Risks Report, and it said, I quote, "Shifting the burden of a welfare benefit to the BBC to reduce the deficit appears likely to have fiscally costly unintended consequences." End quote. The fiscal report highlights that pension credit claims increased in the 4 weeks immediately following the BBC's announcement. Now, the Scottish Government wants older people to claim what they are entitled to, having worked all their lives. But it is not the BBC's role to become involved in welfare policy and encouraging people to sign up for pension credit to which they are deserved. So the UK Government's actions to evade their welfare responsibility will result in greater costs to the public purse. Linking the free TV licence to pension credit may actually increase the uptake of that benefit. Now, we want those eligible to take up their benefit. But I would point out, as the OBR have pointed out, that even if 250,000 people of the 1.3 million claim pension credit who didn't previously do so, it would cost the Treasury an estimated £745 million. So it's not just a moral case. From the financial point of view, there is a strong case to reverse this policy. Pension credit uptake is further impacted by the changes implemented by the UK Government on the 15th of May 2019, affecting mixed-age couples, where one is of pension age and the other is of working age. Pensioners will no longer be able to apply for pension credit if their partner is of working age. They will need to instead apply to the now notorious universal credit until their partner reaches state pension age. Our Scottish Government analysis has shown that this could lead to an annual loss of as much as £7,000 for those affected, because pension credit entitlements are typically higher than universal credit. Our estimates indicate that in 2023-24, around 5,600 Scottish households could be affected by this policy. And of course, women have also been affected by the changes made by the UK Government. Over 2 million WASPI women paid their national insurance contribution in the full expectation that they would receive their state pension at a certain age, only for the goalposts to be moved by the UK Government. They will be now forced to work longer. And those women will be doubly affected by the changes with the mixed-age couples pension. And ultimately, all these welfare changes impact on people and people's lives. And the impact on the people of over 75 who now will have the automatic benefit of a free TV licence ripped away. Now, some may be able to afford to fill the gap every month, but there are many thousands who will be worrying about what choices they will have to make when it comes to their monthly outgoings if they have to pay the licence fee. Forcing people to make difficult choices about what they can and cannot afford is not right. For many, TV is a lifeline. And we know that older people in our society can be at greater risk of social isolation and loneliness, as the Labour Party amendment, which we'll be supporting, points out. And they might not be able to get out and about as much. TV provides a link to what's going on in the world, and it offers people the chance to be entertained and indeed to escape. Viewing figures from Ofcom show that over 54s watch the most TV of any age group in Scotland, around 5.5 hours on average a day. Access to television allows older people to enjoy educational documentaries, listen to news and current affairs, hear stories, see images of countries they've never been to. TV can expand people's knowledge and horizons, and it can provide shared experiences, connection and entertainment to talk about with their families. There is a need for companionship, friendship, connection. Older people need that as much as anybody else. So destructive policies such as the one proposed and been implemented by the UK Government will only cause harm to people who are trying to enjoy their retirement after a long working life. In Scotland, the largest increase in population over the past few years has been in the over 75 age group, with this projected to increase. So it's inexcusable to allow or support policies that disadvantage our older people who have already contributed so much and still continue to do so. The Scottish Government supports our older people, yet we are seeing our ambitions negatively impacted by Westminster time and time again. UK Government social policies should be funded by the UK Government. Licence fee funds should be devoted to delivering the BBC's public purposes, including the purpose to help people understand and engage with the world around them, which is vitally important for older people. Public service broadcasting should be universally accessible to all, and older people should not be denied being part of this. So let's be absolutely clear. In the 2015 Charter Renewal BBC settlement, the UK Government gave the BBC a Trojan horse, paving the way for public services broadcasting to be undermined by creating conditions that weaken the public broadcasting model. Briefly.
Jeremy Balfour.
We should that when made between the BBC and the government, the BBC accepted that and made no complaint about it at the time.
I think the BBC had made many complaints about this. This was about tying their hands behind their back and saying, take this or leave it. And at a time when the BBC faces unprecedented competition in a rapidly changing communications environment, it's important that the public service model is properly funded so it can be healthy and competitive. I think the UK government knew exactly what it was doing in making sure that the BBC carried the can for this unpopular policy. So it's difficult to comprehend the UK government's position. We should be celebrating our older people, be thankful that people are living longer, healthier lives and allowing them to enjoy their third age. This is a colossal failure in social policy making by the UK government. The issue is rightly being debated in the Scottish Parliament. Let us stand up for our over 75s and demand the UK government pay for the free licences once again, and I move the motion in my name.
I call Rachel Hamilton to speak to and move Amendment 19967.2 for around 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let us set some background here. Television has the wonderful ability to transform us from our sitting room to anywhere across the world. It has the power to inspire people to see things differently and to question the norm. Let's face it, for £154.50, the BBC does offer good value, and every service they provide is valued by someone across our society. It also has the ability to shape public opinion. Just look at how the vivid and resplendent images of David Attenborough's Blue Planet have been so influential. They've been seen enacted societal change in a way that we view our planet and plastic pollution. To think a TV series has achieved the largest shift in public opinion is an issue is absolutely colossal. For most of us, television is an important connection with the outside world that informs and entertains. Television is not just a medium for keeping abreast of the latest developments across the UK and the world, but it's also an important social tool as well. And that is why we have some sympathy and empathy with Claire Baker's amendment for Labour today. And we know it can tackle social isolation, as Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary, has also said, especially for those who cannot socialise outside of the home due to mobility issues. Some 100,000 Scots experience social isolation, so a TV licence is very important in our day-to-day lives. And those people who enjoy watching the energetic dancing of Strictly on a Saturday or the roaring engines of Top Gear not only provides entertainment but helps tackle the issues associated with social isolation. Fundamentally, television should be accessible to all, and that is why we on these benches are frustrated at the decision to remove the television licence, as we expected the BBC to continue this important concession. Now, Lord Hall said in July 2015 that the deal would give the BBC financial stability. He said, to counter, can I just quote this, please, Miss Baker? To counter, you've got to see this in an entire package, the modernisation of the licence fee, along with the removal of part of our top slicing, alongside the commitment to the licence fee going up alongside inflation. These three things, and one or two other things, These three things mean that we can plan with a sense of financial stability. And there is consensus across the chamber that we see the UK government get round the table with the BBC to find an appropriate solution to the matter in hand. Yes, I'll give way.
Claire Baker.
Thank you. Does the member accept that the cost of the over 75 licence fee was estimated to be £745 million of its budget, and for the BBC to continue that policy alone, it would be a huge drop in the income that they have to deliver for everyone?
Rachel Hamilton.
I do accept that, and also I accept that the financial stability that Lord Hall talks about actually equated to approximately 700 million. So the BBC, we're supporting that the BBC find a way through this with the package that they were given in the renewal of the BBC Charter. Presiding officer, from the off, let's get the facts straight. Not just now, thank you, Ms Martin. Presiding officer, from the off, let's get the facts straight on where the responsibility lies with over 75 TV licences. To better understand the crux of the matter, let's go back to July 2015. A funding deal was agreed between the government and the BBC as part of that charter renewal. The key element was that the BBC would take over funding of free TV licences for the over 75s in return for those certain concessions. For example, the government agreed to close the iPlayer loophole, and that was a cause of significant income loss for the BBC, and said that legislation to that effect would be brought before Parliament in the near future. The BBC agreed to take on the cost of funding of over 75 licences in 2015 and said it was the right deal at the time, and I quote Lord Hall. Yet the BBC should have acted earlier to communicate the likelihood that they would not be able to carry on the concession from 2020. The UK government have guaranteed the level of the licence fee will increase with inflation until 2022, which ensures the BBC continues to deliver high-quality, distinctive content for all audiences, and none of us are disagreeing about that. And under the BBC's current plans, the poorest pensioners will continue to be helped, as the BBC stated that those eligible for pension credit would still receive a free TV licence, although we are unhappy that the BBC's decision doesn't cover all over 75s. It concerns me that 12,000 of over 75s in my constituency will be affected by the loss of that exemption. I will.
Annabel Ewing.
I'm grateful to the member for taking intervention. Does the member feel that it is right that the UK government, UK Tory government in this instance, should hand responsibility for administering part of the benefit system to a non-government body, which is the BBC?
Rachel Hamilton.
So I've already said that, thank you for the intervention, but I've already said that the Lord Hall's quote about financial stability and the package at the time. There was agreement that the package due to the renewal of the BBC Charter was agreed. The Chamber will be aware that the BBC is operationally independent. Taxpayers want to see the independent public service broadcaster using its own substantial licence fee appropriately to ensure it delivers for UK audiences. In 2018, the BBC received over £3.8 billion in licence fee income, the highest ever, and it receives over £1 billion a year from commercial work such as selling content abroad, and this must be reinvested appropriately. People want to see the BBC using its substantial licence fee income in an appropriate way to ensure it delivers for UK audiences, which includes showing restraint on salaries for senior staff. Whilst the BBC has a responsibility to ensure it manages its budget appropriately, it announced the most narrowly defined option for reform of the over 75s concession. It's important to note that this was the BBC's decision and not the government's after Parliament legislation to give the BBC the full responsibility from 2020. And I understand that there are people in the chamber today who don't agree with that, but perhaps I don't agree with the times that they haven't supported institutions that have the word British in them. My UK government colleagues, including the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, has already met with the BBC to press them to consider further help they can provide in light of this decision. We want the Secretary of State to continue to push the BBC to continue to support free licences, and my colleague Jackson Carlo was explicit in his position to the BBC's his opposition to the BBC's decision when he met the Prime Minister Boris Johnson a few months ago. In closing, I want to reiterate my dismay and our dismay on these benches at the BBC's decision. Television is important to the lives of many people, but especially older people. The TV offers not only light entertainment, but it also used to help tackle social isolation. In the motion put forward by the Cabinet Secretary today, it's clear the SNP would rather blame the UK government instead of working constructively. Their motion just kicks the can down the road when it comes to finding a resolution for those over 75s that must have a free TV licence. The SNP's announcement is simply a rehash of Jeremy Corbyn's policy. Last year, the Labour leader announced plans for an independent body setting the licence fee, and I believe that he's made a commitment today in his manifesto today. But when it comes to their separatist agenda, the SNP have failed to explain what would happen to the BBC in Scotland. Only on these benches will we continue to work with our colleagues and ensure we see real action by getting the BBC to find a viable solution. The ball is firmly in their court when it comes to responsibility. The BBC Director General made it clear in 2015, and he said the cost of the over 75s on us has been more than matched by the deal coming back for the BBC. We want the BBC to honour that, and we join the calls from the UK government for the BBC to find and support a resolution to this matter in order to keep over 75s licences free. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
If you would move your amendment, please, Ms Finlay.
I move my amendment in my
Thank
name.
you very much. I now call Claire Baker to speak to and move amendment 19967.1. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Free TV licences for the over 75s were introduced by a Labour government under Gordon Brown as Chancellor in 1999, with the cost covered via general taxation. The move was part of action to help reduce poverty among pensioners, with the BBC paid directly by government to replace income lost from the licences. The concession was broadly understood as a top-up entitlement for over 75s, which sought to deliver improvements via universal benefits for older people. The introduction of the free TV licence came alongside expanded social care access. It was part of a balance between means testing of benefits like pension credits and universal benefits, all of which sought to prevent older people experiencing poverty. This was introduced as a social benefit. When the Conservative government said it would no longer fund the scheme, phasing out support by 2020, leaving the BBC to take on the cost of £745 million a year, it went completely against the basis of the funding of free licence fees as a welfare policy. Labour was and is completely opposed to this decision and firmly of the belief that the Conservative government was wrong to outsource social policy in this way. The deal struck in 2015 between the Chancellor George Osborne and the BBC took place behind closed doors and in a very short timescale. Discussions like this should not be done in a backroom deal, and they should not be forced at short notice by the government with no attempt at transparency or consultation. Setting the licence fee should not be the sole responsibility of government. The process must be transparent and there needs to be clear accountability for decisions taken. The viewer's voice must be heard. Negotiations should no longer take place behind closed doors with little input from the BBC and none from viewers. The BBC is going through an exciting time. Here in Scotland, we have the new channel. There's been an overhaul of the iPlayer, and there are more co-productions and international collaborations. But it's also a challenging time with an increasingly varied and competitive market. There is a lot of public support for the BBC and their role as a public sector broadcaster. The viewer needs to feel greater ownership of the BBC and be able to express that value. The setting of the licence fee must be free from government social policy and be taken in the interest of the viewer and the listener. While today is focused on the over 75s licence fee, the Tory government had previous form. In 2013, it was announced that the funding of the BBC's valued World Service would transfer from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to the BBC licence fee. At the time, Peter Horrocks, Director of the World Service, said the service was determined that this unexpected cut should not damage existing services to audiences. And while the BBC would protect and continue the service, they would not be able to invest in new programmes and platforms as planned. Again, no consultation, no dialogue. This is funding which had existed for decades, and although it had changed significantly as a service, there was no indication from government that they expected it to end. They just withdrew their support. The announcement by the BBC that from June 2020, only those over 75 who are in receipt of pension credit would be entitled to a licence fee paid by the BBC was a direct result of the Conservative government's decision. The fact the Conservatives then sought to frame it as some fault of the BBC and continue to do that this afternoon rather than accept it as their responsibility is disgraceful. The BBC is responsible for this decision only insofar as the Conservative government forced them to make it. That the Conservative amendment today continues to insist in calling it a BBC decision with no context is at best disingenuous and at worst shameless. The subsequent position taken by the BBC followed a consultation which closed earlier this year and involved research with stakeholders and members of the public. What emerged from this consultation was the difficult choices facing the BBC in taking this decision and having to balance the impact for older people against its responsibility to deliver programmes and services for everyone. To fully fund the continuation of the full exemption would cost the BBC £745 million of its budget, around 1/5. According to the BBC annual report and accounts for 2018, this equates the amount spent on all of BBC Two, BBC Three, BBC Four, the BBC News Channel, CBBC and CBeebies, or equivalent to the amount spent on all of its TV sport, its drama, its entertainment and comedy programmes. So this would have been a dramatic change to the income that the BBC received. And I find it difficult for the Conservatives to be dismissing the importance of that figure this afternoon and not recognise the impact it would have on the BBC to fully fund what was that social policy. So in Scotland, the number of households expected to lose their free TV licence next year approaches 250,000. I welcome the briefing provided by Age Scotland for this debate. It highlights research showing that over half of 75 say their main form of company is a TV or a pet, and that 100,000 of older people in Scotland feel lonely all or most of the time. The risk of isolation and loneliness are compounded for many who are already taking difficult decisions on which bills they can afford and which they cannot. A petition by Age UK to save TV licences for those over 75 attracted over 630,000 signatures, all demanding that the government take back responsibility for the funding of free TV licences. Research which they carried out found that over 40% of over 75s in the UK would not be able to afford a TV licence without cutting back on essentials like heating or food. The decision to change entitlement to free TV licences means pensioners will be required to prove receipt of pension credit in order to get an exemption. It is estimated that around 2/5 of those eligible for pension credit are not currently claiming it, some because they don't know how to claim it, they don't know if they're entitled to, and some because of stigma which is attached to it. In Scotland, it is estimated that more than 122,000 entitled households are currently not receiving pension credit, and there are further issues, as the Cabinet Secretary highlighted, around the mixed age coupled rules and those who are marginally above the threshold for the benefit. In terms of wider impacts, there is potential for increased strain on public services if vulnerable people become more isolated or have mental health issues as a result of a loss of companionship, which TV can provide. There are also particular concerns regarding older people with dementia and how they will be affected. While some will receive pension credit and thus be eligible for a free licence, an estimated 553,000 older people with dementia in the UK are expected to lose their free TV licence, including over 140 of those who are aged over 90. So the Labour amendment to this debate seeks to highlight the impact this decision will have for older people, many of whom already live in relative poverty. The additional pressures they will face economically and socially as a result of the Conservative government's actions should be recognised. A Labour government would restore TV licences for free for all over 75s, and I hope we can get consensus on that this afternoon, that it is the responsibility of government and it should be restored. Universal access to publicly funded public sector broadcasting has many benefits, particularly for older people, and it must be maintained. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Ms Baker. I now call Alison Johnson. Ms Johnson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For some time now, we've been promised the end of austerity from the UK Government. Yet this summer, another cut was announced, this time to free TV licences for the over 75s, which, as we've heard, was a cut explicitly ruled out by the UK Government in its 2017 election manifesto.
Sorry, just a minute, Ms Johnson.
Certainly.
I'm sorry to say, I know there are quiet conversations at the back. When it's a quiet chamber, I can hear everything. And I'm sure you don't want me to. Ms Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yeah, as we've heard, this was a cut explicitly ruled out by the UK government in its 2017 election manifesto, but it was passed on to the BBC. They had to do it. They had to make that difficult announcement. So all older people will be forced to pay for their TV licence. They'll need to pay an additional £154 a year. This may not be much to some people, but for the poorest households, this is a significant proportion of their income. I mean, the BBC's own analysis suggests that it is as much as 2% of annual income for those in the poorest 10% of households. And I think when we're looking at that fact, we have to bear in mind, as Age Scotland tell us in the briefing, and let's not forget this, the UK has the lowest state pension of all the most advanced economies in the world. You know, that is absolutely woeful. That is not something we should be proud of. So to make this further cut, it's simply, you know, I just think it beggars belief. The other thing that we know for a fact is that poverty amongst older people is now rising. It's not falling. Relative poverty for pensioners in Scotland has jumped by 3% since 2014. This is the last thing they need. No wonder then that a survey conducted by Age UK has found that over 40% of people aged over 75 either won't be able to afford a TV licence or they'll have to cut back on essentials to pay for it if the concession is scrapped. And if those who said they would have to cut back, a quarter plan to reduce spending on heating and a fifth on food. Now, the latest figures show, there's been discussion on this in the Chamber already, that across the UK, 60% of those eligible for pension credit actually receive it, and this is as low as 50% for couples. According to COSLA estimates, that's around 130,000 Scots who would be eligible for but not receive the TV licence under the proposed scheme. In a system based on pension credit passporting, 600,000 UK households eligible for but not claiming pension credit would therefore not get the free licence. And the plans are based on a 75% take-up of pension credit, which would be a considerable improvement, and there's not a sufficiently robust plan to achieve that. Now, the BBC has said it will contact all older people impacted by the change to advise them to apply for pension credit. But, you know, I sit on the Social Security Committee. We're currently midway through an investigation into benefit take-up. And, you know, this is a very complex area, and we know that older people in particular can be extremely reluctant to claim, even when they are entitled to benefits. And I think the fact that we're putting this work onto the BBC, it simply makes no sense. There are, you know, skill sets needed here that you might not have in a public service broadcaster, and why should they? And we've heard that the change will be particularly unfair to older people with younger partners who can, you know, no longer claim pension credit as a result of further changes made by the UK government introduced this year. A couple with one person over 75 and one under 65 would lose both £7,000 from being forced to claim universal credit and an additional £154 in having to pay for a TV licence. I think the point has been well made that TV is a vital lifeline for many older Scots. According to Age Scotland, half, I find this quite, you know, this is sad. Half of over 75 say that their main form of company is the television or a pet. I think bringing that into this debate makes us, you know, we should be striving as a parliament and as a nation to address that. You know, if there's one good thing that this debate is doing, it's bringing up this as an issue. 100,000 older people in Scotland feel lonely all or most of the time. 200,000 will go half a week without a visit or a call from anyone. You know, for those who can't afford to pay, the proposals mean that many older Scots will lose what is sadly their only source of company for large parts of the week. The accountability issue has been raised by Annabel Ewing in her intervention. The free TV licence for over 75s is essentially a social security benefit, albeit in kind. Now, the UK government introduced it, and they should remain responsible for it. But what it has done is to outsource responsibility for a benefit to the BBC. This sets a really worrying precedent as governments should make and be accountable for social security policy, not a public body which is not elected. A bizarre move, and I do have to ask, you know, whatever next? I think Rachel Hamilton began her her contribution, you know, speaking of the importance to TV, the importance of TV, she spoke, you know, for over a minute on how important that was. So I find it, quite frankly, baffling that there isn't more of a concerted effort amongst the Scottish Conservatives to get the UK government to change its policy. This is simply absolutely wrong-headed. I think I'm going to start, I'm going to close, presiding officer, by just reiterating that fact. The UK has the lowest state pension of all the most advanced economies in the world, and this is the last thing our over-75s need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call Mike Rumbles. Mr Rumbles, please.
Well, for almost 20 years, individuals aged over 75 have been entitled to free TV licences. The UK has one of the lowest state pensions of any of the advanced Western economies, and at the time free TV licences were introduced, it was widely seen as a means of increasing pensioner benefits without having to increase the state pension. Other free benefits were also introduced, such as the winter fuel allowance, and this too was seen in the same light. I trust the UK government hasn't any plans to end this too, but knowing what they've done with TV licences, I'm a little worried about that. Now, we all know that broadcasting and the TV licence is a reserved matter for the UK Parliament to deal with. But that doesn't mean, however, that we here in the Scottish Parliament can't take a view on the decisions made by our UK government and Parliament that affect the people of Scotland. The BBC itself has said that any pensioner who is in receipt of pension credit will not have to pay for their TV licence. However, the fact is that about 300,000 over 75s will lose out on having a free licence and will have to pay the almost £155 fee themselves. Now, many pensioners, no doubt, will be able to afford this fee. Maybe that's what the Conservatives are thinking. But there is also no doubt that there will be many over 75s whose income is just above the pension credit level who cannot. Indeed, there will be many who do not even claim pension credit. And so far, almost everyone speaking has mentioned and referred to Age Scotland's brief. And I make no apology for reiterating what we've heard that already today, and it does bear repeating, and it's an extremely important and effective brief. According to that brief from Age Scotland, some 60% of those pensioners who are eligible to claim pension credit don't do it. That's some 122,000 households. It is the welfare of these individuals that must concern us here, and that is why it is appropriate to debate this welfare issue today. Age Scotland also tells us that 100,000 older people in Scotland feel lonely all or the most of the time. And the Greens beat me by saying that over half of 75 say that their main form of company is the TV or indeed a pet. Absolutely right. I agree with Age Scotland that free TV licences for the over 75s is a welfare policy. It clearly is a welfare policy. And that it was wrong for the BBC to be given this responsibility by the UK government. The Liberal Democrats believe that the independence of the BBC needs to be protected, and therefore the UK government needs to set up a BBC licence fee commission to do just that. Presiding officer, we support the Scottish government's motion before us today because it reflects very much what we believe to be right. The licence fee needs to be set independently of the UK government to decouple the setting of the fee from any undue influence that links wider funding of initiatives that should rightly be the responsibility of our United Kingdom government. We also support wholeheartedly Labour's amendment highlighting the points I've been making already in this speech. But we will not be supporting the Conservative amendment, which actually tries to shift the blame on this withdrawal of free TV licences for the over 75s to the BBC itself. And I heard Rachel Hamilton say this. This is exactly what she tried to do this afternoon. Her argument that the BBC had agreed to do this reminds me of a certain Don Corleone's phrase from The Godfather, that they were going to make them an offer they couldn't refuse. I find the Conservative amendment disappointing, to say the least. It completely ignores, and this is the sad bit, it completely ignores the estimated 122,000 households where pensioners could claim pension credit but don't. Where is the reference to these people on the very lowest incomes in the Conservative amendment? They are not there. They are completely ignored. Universal benefits like free TV licences for the over 75s and of course the winter fuel allowance have been successful in helping the lowest income pensioners, particularly because they are not means tested. I don't believe for 1 minute that the Conservatives don't understand this. They're very intelligent people. Rachel Hamilton is a very intelligent person. No, they are. No, come on, they are. Which compounds the problem. It compounds the problem. In my view, it can only mean that they're not interested in those people who fall through the pension credit safety net, or they wouldn't have put this amendment down in the form it is in the first place. Presiding Officer, we will not be supporting their amendment at decision time.
Thank you very much. Open debate. Annabel Ewing to be followed by Maurice Corrie. Ms Ewing, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to have been called to speak in this important Scottish Government debate this afternoon on TV licences for the over 75s. As has been said already, the background to this issue is that the UK Tory government, in what can only be termed a shady deal with the BBC back in 2015, proposed that the BBC take over the funding of TV licences for the over 75s from June 2020. In exchange, it would appear, for a promise of increases in the TV licence fee. These discussions were far from transparent and indeed were described as being conducted in a hasty and secretive manner in the House of Commons Culture Committee's report published on 11th October of this year. The next all too, in my view, predictable development was that the BBC announcement in June of this year. This was to the effect that free TV licences for the over 75s would no longer be of universal application, but rather would be restricted from June 2020 to those households in receipt of pension credit, thereby removing some 3.75 million households from entitlement to a free TV licence. But at the same time, Presiding Officer, we saw the UK government, Tory government, sneak out in May of this year by way of a written statement the bombshell announcement that pension credit could no longer be claimed for households where a couple included an individual of working age. Rather, mixed-age couples would be forced to go down the route of claiming universal credit, a move likely to cost households up to £7,000 per annum. And as if that was not bad enough, Presiding Officer, for hard-pressed pensioners in Scotland and indeed the rest of the UK, we are all too well aware of the consistently low take-up rate for pension credit itself. This, in fact, has been a perennial problem from the outset, since pension credit was introduced in the early 2000s. And I recall indeed raising this very issue at the time when I served as the MP for Perth in the House of Commons. Indeed, I had asked at that time Labour ministers what estimate had been made of the likely take-up, and unsurprisingly, I did not receive any credible answers at that time. In fact, we see that take-up of pension credit is flatlining around 64% under successive Labour, Tory Liberal and Tory UK governments. And in terms of a House of Commons Library paper of 19th July of this year, it is to be noted with considerable concern that in 2016-17, up to 1.3 million families entitled to receive pension credit did not claim, and up to £3.5 billion worth of potential pension credit went unspent. What a cynical approach indeed on the part of successive Westminster governments to state pension provision in the United Kingdom, notwithstanding that, as has been mentioned, pensions are an entitlement based on a social contract on the part of the individual with the state. And this cynical approach on the part of the UK government to state pension provision is evident in the OECD and EU League tables of pension provision, where we see the UK, of course, consistently amongst the lowest. This is simply not good enough, Presiding Officer, for we know, as we have heard, that loneliness and isolation is a significant problem for far too many pensioners, and that the TV is their companion. We know that many pensioners in Scotland and across the UK are very much up against it financially, with the paltry state pension on offer exacerbated by Tory Liberal and Tory austerity years. We know too that the entitlement to pension credit has been slashed by the Tory government, and that take-up, as I've said, in any event, on the part of those who will remain entitled is still far too low. So therefore, in that context, the restriction of the free TV licence for over 75s to those in receipt of pension credit is, as I say, a very cynical ploy indeed. And let us be very clear that this is not at heart the fault of the BBC. And the UK Tory government's attempts, and we've heard this from the Tory front bench today, to deflect blame will simply not work. The BBC is a public broadcaster. Its founding charter does not provide for it to be an arm of the Department for Work and Pensions in administering the benefit system. It is not a government public body. Rather, that responsibility, the administration of the benefit system, is totally the responsibility of government. And it comes as no surprise to anyone, I think, that Boris Johnson is trying to abdicate his responsibility. Presiding officer, this is just not good enough. Pensioners in my constituency of Cowdenbeath and across Scotland, and indeed across the United Kingdom as a whole, deserve so much better. The UK Tory government must reinstate the free TV licence for the over 75s. It must take responsibility for this and not farm out state benefit administration as a matter of principle to non-governmental bodies who are unaccountable. And I would also take this opportunity to call on the UK Tory government to reverse the cuts to pension credit and to explain what it will do to increase the take-up of pension credit going forwards. And I would also call on the government, UK government presiding officer in conclusion, to start treating pensioners with dignity and with respect, be it the waspy women who it continues to ignore, be it the ridiculous proposal of Ian Duncan-Smith to put back the retirement age to 75 years, a proposal that has not been ruled out by any UK or Scottish Parliament Tory politician as far as I am aware, or be it the UK government's track record of providing amongst the lowest state pensions in the OECD. The UK Tory government has failed pensioners. Tory politicians, be they MPs or MSPs in this Parliament, have failed pensioners. And I am sure that pensioners will reflect on these matters in the immediate weeks ahead. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Maurice Corrie to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Mr Corrie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome this opportunity today to speak on the subject of TV licences for over 75s and over. Many of these individuals rely on their television on a daily basis, far more than just a colourful screen in the corner. It not only provides entertainment in the quiet, lonely hours, but also a window to and connection with a larger outside world that they may no longer have access to. In some situations, television may be the only consistent form of interaction and connection that an individual may have. It fulfills the role of a necessary lifeline to these individuals in a variety of ways. The concession scheme made it possible for all pensioners to have access to this lifeline, no matter their financial status, and thereby providing them with an essential piece in their overall health. As we all know, in July, the BBC announced their policy change concerning the over 75 TV licences that will take effect next year. The policy announced is without doubt an unsatisfactory and disappointing one, as it leaves millions of pensioners without a guaranteed access to this integral lifetime. And in my area, or my region of West Scotland, more than 62,000 individuals will be directly impacted by this change. I am grateful that the final decision does not include discarding the concession scheme in its entirety. Those over 75 who receive pension credit are the poorest pensioners and certainly in need of support during this period in their lives. And I appreciate that the BBC recognised this and included it in their decision-making process, but it is not enough, and I repeat the calls for the BBC to support free TV licences for all people over 75. Yes, I will.
I thank Maurice Corrie for giving way. Could he tell me whether he personally supports the government being responsible for welfare policy or other bodies?
Maurice Corrie.
I think in this case, what happened with the renewal of the Charter, Deputy Presiding Officer, is that they wanted to ensure that there was a lot of involvement and the BBC understanding its market, the people who used it, and therefore, quite rightly, there was a shift of responsibility in relation to the new Charter as part of the deal. Those individuals who qualify for pension credits are not the only group that are especially disadvantaged by the removal of free licences. But being an armed forces veteran myself, it is well known that I'm a strong advocate of supporting our veterans. They deserve our utmost respect and support in return for the brave and essential services that they provide to our country. In the same year that the government implemented the TV licences scheme, the Armed Forces Covenant was introduced to the public. This covenant states quite clearly that we as a nation will not allow our servicemen and women to become disadvantaged as a result of their service to us, and that we will sustain and reward them for their services. I mention this covenant as a reminder of our obligations to our veterans. Many veterans, no matter how they serve, come home with injuries, disabilities and other health concerns that continue to impact them both physically, psychologically and financially into their pension years. The additional care which these conditions require adds costs to many veterans' pensions and makes it more difficult, if not impossible, to pay for a licence for the television, and can result in this group losing the much-needed access to the BBC services. Removing the assistance of free licences from our veterans takes away a service that is essential for warding off the loneliness that many of them experience. Veterans can, like many of their peers, suffer from the loneliness that comes from growing older. This age-related loneliness is often heightened by the loneliness and isolation related with serving in the forces. And studies have shown that veterans are more likely to experience loneliness than the general population, especially those that have experienced some form of trauma while serving. Television can and do play a vital role in mitigating the loneliness that they experience, and to remove access to this tool is at risk of going against the Armed Forces Covenant, and it enables a direct consequence of military service to further disadvantage our veterans. An exemption must be included for our veterans to ensure that they are not disadvantaged in a situation losing access to television. Now, I recognise that the veterans are not the only group that face group-specific challenges. It would be naive to have such a view, and this conversation should not revolve around only those that are most disadvantaged by the policy change, or those most in need of television. It is a policy that impacts all pensioners, and all should be included. And the role that television plays for each pensioner is individual, but equally important for all their overall well-being and standard of living. And as such, this scheme should be considered and treated as a social care concern that necessitates careful consideration by the BBC. With this in mind, I would welcome discussions between the BBC and the UK Government to create a policy which better addresses this issue at hand. And I hope that the Scottish Government will be open to making some constructive contributions where possible as part of these conversations. And no matter the course taken, it is important that the independence of the BBC from any government is maintained. And that independence is what allows the BBC to provide the public with high-quality, nutrient services and programmes. I'll give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
He makes the very valid point that the BBC should be independent. How can the BBC be independent if it's carrying out a government social welfare policy funding over 75s?
Maurice Corrie.
Deputy Presiding Officer, it's part of the deal. As I said to Mr Rumbles earlier on, it was part of the negotiation deal. We need to grow up to the fact that that's what happens when you negotiate. The new deal came in for the new age, and therefore it would take responsibilities. A company has social responsibilities as well as a government. The excellent level of the BBC and the trust that the UK public has in its services should not be jeopardised as work is done towards improving the policy. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, I would welcome continued conversation to reverse and revise the disappointing over 75 licence fee policy put forward by the BBC. While it is certainly positive that those on pension credit will continue to receive a free licence fee, free licence TV fee, it does not address many serious drawbacks that other groups, such as veterans over 75, will face by the removal of this exemption. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I call the next member, and I absolutely appreciate why you made that speech, but as a huge part of it is to do with special provision for welfare, can I just make the comment it would have been useful if that had been in the Conservative amendment, because the point of an amendment is to give notice to the Chamber what your arguments are going to be, just to put that on the record. I'm not saying you've done the wrong thing, but I think it would have been helpful, as it should really have been an amendment, because most of your speech was about that. Thank you. I now call Kenneth Gibson, followed by Mark Griffith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Page 66 of Forward Together, the Conservative Party's 2017 election manifesto said, and I quote, "We will maintain all other pensioner benefits, including free bus passes, eye tests, prescriptions and TV licences for the duration of this Parliament." This reads as a very clear promise to pensioners that their free TV licences would remain intact. Nevertheless, in June of this year, the UK Tory government announced it would scrap the free television licence for 3.7 million over 75s across the UK, a plan that will come into effect as of June 2020, impacting on 328,000 Scottish pensioners who will now have to pay £154.50 a year or face a £1,000 fine. Even though the manifesto promised to maintain the free licence, the UK Tory government outsourced the responsibility for television licence support for over 75s to the BBC, which deliberated and decided to provide TV licences to those who can prove their receipt of pension credit, a means-tested benefit designed to help pensioners who are struggling to make ends meet. However, to the Tories I ask, how do you means test for loneliness and social exclusion? What about those who are just above the threshold for claiming pension credit and for whom the yearly fee could just push them below the poverty line? Nearly a third of over 75s in the UK live on or below that poverty line. And according to Age Scotland, as we've heard already this afternoon, 122,000 pensioners in Scotland, around 40% of those who are eligible for pension credit do not claim it. Perhaps this is because they don't know they're eligible, may struggle to apply it, or are simply embarrassed about needing extra help. Calling the helpline is not the answer because no one ever answers it, which can only be deliberate. The added yearly cost of TV licences will cause serious distress and anxiety among Scotland's poorest, oldest and most vulnerable pensioners. Age Scotland's research shows that almost 6 in 10 single pensioners and 4 in 10 older couples already find it hard to pay their heating bills, and 38% of older people feel financially squeezed. No one should have to choose between heating, eating, and something as important to older people as television. The average BBC viewer these days is 62 years old. 1.8 million over 75s live alone, and many count on the TV for company. Many are widowed, housebound, or live far from their families, and so TV is one of their only connections to society. Founder of the National Pensioners Convention, Jack Jones, once pointed out that 1 in 5 over 70s never see anyone from one week to the next. Clearly, television is more than just entertainment for some of our most vulnerable older citizens. Let's think about it another way. Pensioners who can't afford the fee might choose to go without. This could lead to even further isolation and loneliness, ultimately placing more strain on the NHS. Some argue that the rise of cheap online streaming means that we have a greater choice of programming today than ever, but for thousands of elderly people who may not be tech literate or confident with subscription services like these, this is just not an option. Last month, Age Scotland warned of a rise in fraud, with scammers posing as representatives from TV licensing. Last month alone, more than 16,000 people who signed a switched-off, save-free TV licence for older people petition were targeted by fraudsters who claimed there was a problem with the recipient's licence payment and that they should pay up right away. Imagine you're an unlucky pensioner forced to pay the extra fee by the Tories, and then you get a letter through the door asking you to pay it again, or worse, the £1,000 fine that comes with not paying the fee. What a kick in the teeth that is for Scottish pensioners who've worked hard all their lives and yet cannot seem to catch a break under the Tories. Not only will this cruel plan affect pensioners, it will affect our society in a different way. As streaming services such as Netflix are on the rise, traditional broadcasting channels are having to compete by putting on more and more compelling programmes. The BBC is no different. The cost of having to subsidise free licences to eligible pensioners, combined with the loss of revenue from younger people who increasingly choose the Netflix fee over the yearly licence, will be significant. In evidence to Culture, Tourism Europe and External Affairs Committee only a fortnight ago, the BBC said that paying the licence fees of over 75s would cost BBC Scotland £38 million out of a £249 million budget, 16% of the total. This can only have an adverse impact on the broadcaster's ability to produce the high-quality drama we expect and appreciate. The BBC is a creative employer which produces some of the finest programmes in the world, but if they're having to pay for TV licences for the elderly, the unprecedented cuts to programming budgets will make it increasingly difficult to hire as many creatives or compete with other TV providers. Presiding Officer, when will this relentless attack by the Tories on pensioners end? For too long, the Conservative government has treated pensioners badly, WASPy Women being a perfect example, and the scrapping of the free TV licence is yet another indication of that. The reality is that television is a lifeline for the elderly. The Tories want to scrap these licences without taking any responsibility, and it simply won't wash. If they're referring, as they have been doing in their fig leaf-like contributions today, to some deal in 2015, one wonders why they put it in a 2017 manifesto that they were going to continue to pay these licences. So where is the truth in this? And I would expect them to say something about that in their winding up. And as for the pitiful defence by Tory MSPs of the indefensible, it's frankly embarrassing and further evidence of their dog-like devotion to whatever nonsensical UK government policies are imposed, not no matter how reprehensible. The BBC is a broadcaster, not a division of the Department of Work and Pensions, and that is how it should stay. And the UK Government must restore pensions to the TV licence payments to the over 75s.
Thank you. Mark Griffin, to be followed by Gillian Martin. Ms Martin will be the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Griffin, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The timing of this debate is impeccable, with an election in full flow, and as other speakers have mentioned, 20 years now since pensioners found out they were set to benefit from a UK Labour government. A Labour commitment at its universal best, the free TV licence went hand in hand with a winter fuel payment, followed by a minimum income guarantee, and was a core part of social security for pensioners. It was, as the Social Exclusion Unit put it, one part of a package designed to close the terrible gap between the poorest and richest pensioners, which had grown wider than at any time in the last 30 years. And we know the impact of those measures. More than 100,000 pensioners in Scotland were removed from poverty. Instead of 1 in 3 of our older people being in poverty after a Labour government across the UK, just over 1 in 10 remained in poverty. But that trend is reversing as a result of successive Tory governments, up a quarter since the start of the decade. For pensioners themselves, it has a real impact. They're on fixed incomes. This cut will have to be found from somewhere. £13 a month out of budgets for food, or the few activities that they can afford to get out of the house to do, or even the energy bill that powers the TV. Speakers before have quoted Age Scotland statistic that has said that along with a pet, the TV is the main form of company for half of our older pensioners. Now, that's a devastating indictment of our society as a whole, but it demonstrates just how wrong-headed the Tories are for pursuing this cut. When the Chamber debated the government's social isolation strategy in January, we heard how local services for over 60s were falling away in the face of government cuts. Free swimming, Christmas lunches, library services, tea dances, lifeline bus routes, all gone. Is it any surprise then that in the first half of 2019, a third of calls to Silverline Scotland included loneliness as a key theme? Free TV licences are not a burden on government budgets. They are a lifeline to hundreds of thousands of older people across this country. And in part, they have been an insurance policy for a society and government increasingly failing older people. Faced with that bill of £745 million, the BBC have looked to peg entitlement to pension credit. But as Independent Age rightly point out, pension credit is not a good enough proxy for low incomes because take-up is so poor. Gone is the role of DWP staff because of Tory cuts to actively work on increasing pension credit uptake. Today, more than a third, 120,000 people, don't claim for reasons of either lack of awareness, stigma, or simply the complexity, not helped by this lack of service. So this change won't help the poorest of over 75s who are on pension credit, because they're simply not the poorest pensioners. The poorest pensioners out there are the 120,000 who are not claiming pension credit. And the changes to rules around mixed-age couples just adds to the burden and the confusion that is discouraging over 100,000 people from applying for that much-needed entitlement. And that's why, Presiding Officer, the Government's proposal for fees and presumably entitlement to be set independently from government by experts is interesting. Like Age Scotland, many speakers have rightly questioned if the BBC should ever have been responsible for a decision about TV licences and free TV licences, which, as I said earlier, are now a fundamental part of the social security system. And that's a key question that the Tories have repeatedly failed to answer. Whether the BBC agreed to a forced deal or not, they have failed to answer whether they think it is right for a social security entitlement to be administered by the BBC and not by central government. I do wonder, though, whether the same approach was put for consideration as part of the recent consultation on disability assistance. When I asked, I was told that there wouldn't be consultation on the rates of benefits, and government had decided they wouldn't change. And it would be interesting to know from the government whether they will consider an independent expert body for setting entitlements for the devolved benefits we now take control over. Presiding Officer, the Tory amendment today does little more than attempt to justify their decision to cut TV licences, a decision they have forced on the BBC. Even after the contortions of the 2017 campaign, the Tories won't put their hands in the pockets, demonstrating yet again the things they don't value are fair game for cuts. Now, worse still, they now use the licence fee as a device to pitch pensioners against an organisation this country trusts and cherishes. Their leader says he will put the screws on our public service broadcaster, telling it to cough up. That bravado and confrontation are not what pensioners need. They need security, support and promises kept. They need a TV licence, free TV licence, retained in full, and that's what a Labour government will deliver. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Gillian Martin.
Officer, this shameful decision to abdicate responsibility for free TV licences for the over 75s is entirely symptomatic of the way the Tory-led UK government has taken older people for granted. The backroom outsourcing of what is part of welfare policy is simply unconscionable, but it is very deliberate. Locally in my area, it's estimated that 12,230 over 75s in Aberdeenshire will be forced to pay an extra £154.50 in household bills because free TV licences for the over 75s is due to be axed. After years of Tory austerity, the last thing our older people need is more money being taken out of their pockets. The extra burden of this £154.50 to their household bills could have a very serious impact on their welfare. In addition, most of my constituency is populated by rural towns and villages where loneliness and social isolation can have a huge impact on older people. And I welcome the work of the Scottish Government as they prepare to lead internationally through the implementation of a national strategy to address social isolation and loneliness. I welcome this news that's been backed by £1 million of funding over the next 2 years to support and expand innovative approaches to bring people together. But pensioners are being continually targeted by the UK Tory government. This is just the latest raid on their meagre finances. We've already heard members that have said the UK pension is already one of the lowest in Europe. Mixed-age couples are losing their pensioners' partners' entitlement to pension credit. And the WASPy women have been robbed of their pension entitlement. And now they come for your telly. What's next? Access to television should not be understated or trivialised, especially as we enter the winter months when many elderly people struggle to leave the house on cold days and dark winter nights. Access to television is not a luxury, it is a lifeline. And elderly people who cannot afford a TV licence will now be under greater pressure and anxiety as they face the risk of breaking the law if they struggle to find the cash. And the UK government may not be able to means test loneliness, nor can they means test social isolation, but the negative consequences of scrapping free TV licences or putting the burden for that onto the BBC, which the Conservative members have bravely struggled to avoid this afternoon. This risks affecting mental well-being and hampering the Scottish Government's moves to tackle loneliness. Access to TV is already an issue for elderly in my area. I just want to mention that they're also in my area been onslaughted if they go into hospital, having to pay exorbitant fees to access television when they're hospitalised, where they get charged up to £56 a week for bedside teleservices run by Hospidia in NHS Grampian. So the elderly in my area are faced with a double whammy, paying for their TV in their homes, paying for TV when they're ill and vulnerable and in hospital. And I want to urge the UK Government to restore free TV licences to the over 75s and take that responsibility back, because that is the very least that our older people who have worked hard and paid their taxes all their lives deserve. The newsflash is that real people out in the real world who are not interested in political rhetoric are struggling to make ends meet because of Conservative austerity measures. And blaming the BBC, as Rachel Hamilton and others have done today, is a smokescreen for their party's betrayal of the elderly. Free TV licences to over 75s is just another example of Tory betrayal to the most vulnerable in society. free TV licences to the over 75s would be the very minimum that the UK government is doing to support our older people. And as the Cabinet Secretary has said, it's also an attempt to further undermine public service broadcasting, which the UK government, Tory governments, successive Tory governments, are quite happy to see dismantled, like so many other public institutions in the UK. This decision has put additional pressure on the public service that is the envy of the world, and people are always going on about how well respected it is around the world. Now you're putting this additional pressure on them to survive. As Alison Johnson said, the BBC are not set up to administrate a social security service, and nor should they be. Transferring what should be a welfare policy to the BBC is a shameful abdication of duty by the UK government. The next Prime Minister must do the right thing and restore this responsibility and entitlement to everyone aged over 75. And older people should be asking all candidates that are putting themselves forward for that job what they would do and vote accordingly on December the 12th.
Thank you very much. I'm closing speeches now, and I call on Claire Baker to close for Labour. Ms Baker, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been an interesting debate this afternoon, which has recognised the importance of the BBC, and I think largely accepted the case for this benefit for over 75s. Some might argue that the older population has changed, but by setting the level over 75s, this policy does direct support to a more vulnerable group of adults. As recognised, this is a group that spends more time at home. The TV provides a link to the outside world, and it's informing and entertaining. It provides connection and also topics of conversation, and it's a valuable social benefit. And many members highlighted that this afternoon. Alison Johnson described the impact on older people who are living on limited incomes and the vulnerableness they have to loneliness. Mike Rumbles talked about the benefit of universality for this type of policy and the challenges reflected by others of using pensioners' credit as the passport to this benefit. This would inevitably mean that a group of people who would be entitled to the licence fee but aren't applying for their universal credit won't be able to receive it. Annabel Ewing and Mark Griffin both talked about the low uptake of pensioner credit. It was interesting to reflect. A number of members talked about mixed-aged couples, and the changes to pensioner credit means that it's based on the younger partner. It made me think that the over 75s licence fee was actually the opposite. Any household with a person who was over 75 would receive the benefit. It was a more generous benefit that recognised the importance of the person who was over 75 and gave them what they were entitled to, regardless of who else was in the household. Kinda Gibson also raised issues of people experiencing loneliness, highlighting that over 75s can also be often widowed, bereaved. They often live further away from their family, and the importance that the licence fee and the television gives them of a connection to society. And he also highlighted the BBC Scotland budget. So while we've all talked about the kind of 750 million impact it would be on the BBC, within Scotland this would be 38 million out of a £249 million budget. As Kenny Gibson highlighted, that's 16% of BBC Scotland's budget. At a time when the BBC is actually expanding and investing in Scotland, this would have a huge impact. Mark Griffin also talked about the increasing levels of pensioner poverty and isolation, and linked this to the recent social isolation strategy and debate that we had in Parliament, and also made the point that this policy was not a burden on government budgets. It was a lifeline for many. It was a policy that government actually got returns from. It helped older people stay positive, stay interested in life, and gave them that kind of support at home. Gillian Martin was quite rightly to describe it as not trivialising the importance of TV and recognise the real negative consequences there can be for older people, the difficulty some might have in finding the money to pay for it, and also the choice of not paying for it is being faced with being criminalised at a stage in your life where you'd expect that not to be something that affects you. We should recognise that the BBC is envied around the world. It is recognised as the gold standard of public broadcasting. Although there is much else calling for our attention, its viewing figures do remain strong, and it's a British institution which is part of our collective experience. The Conservatives are in a difficult position this afternoon as the UK Government has shifted its position on this so many times. It's hard to keep on message. It is unfortunate their amendment again attempts to blame the BBC for this situation. They called the decision regrettable, but I would say it was inevitable after the ultimatum they were given by the UK Government. George Osborne used this popular social policy as a lever. The government held all the cards, and the Conservatives this afternoon have argued that the BBC accepted that deal. But if you look at today's papers, there has been a recent conference, and Sir David just find his surname, sorry, it's David Clemente, who is the chair of the BBC, reflects on that time and says, I think the deal needs to be seen in the context of the time, 2015. The Conservatives had just won the last election. For the first time, they got to form a majority government rather than a coalition. I don't think Lord Hall was given any option. So if we're realistic about what actually happened in those negotiations, the way in which the position the BBC was placed, I think it's quite clear that the BBC didn't really have any other choice. And people have used the word accountability and recognised the importance of that as the issue, and also government taking responsibility. And Alison Johnson was right to raise concerns that this is a worrying precedent that's been set for the government to actually make a negative decision but try to place the blame onto someone else and shift the blame, and it misrepresents the decision and sees the government trying to avoid responsibility. It's clear that the policy of a free licence fee for over 75s was a social benefit. It was introduced by government, and it is government's responsibility to fund it. It was not a policy that was introduced by the BBC, and any change to it should have been the responsibility of government. George Osborne knew exactly what he was doing by passing the decision to the BBC, but with no funding to deliver it. The consequences of continuing with this policy with no additional budget would have been damaging to the BBC's offer. At a time now we are seeing welcome investment to address some of the issues of regional representation, of greater diversity, of support for the creative sector. This agenda could not be taken forward if the BBC had to make the full cost of this government policy. As Kenny Gibson said, after announcing the benefit would end in the 2017 manifesto, the Conservatives then promised the free licence fee would be protected, a promise that was then broken. And at the time, they even tried to frame it as a mistake and said it was an error of copy and paste about why it was in the manifesto in the first place. We have seen similar reports that Boris Johnson is going to save the free licence fees and include it in the manifesto for this election. But as Mark Griffin quoted, he's also been saying he's going to put the screws on the public service and tell them to cough up. And so Rachel Hamilton this afternoon has insisted that the BBC should fund it. But if that's the BBC's solution, it's not a very good one. It's not one that's going to deliver for the viewer or for the position of the BBC. The Conservatives have shown no shame on this policy. To make a cut as significant as this within welfare policy and then take no responsibility for it is frankly appalling. And when you look at some of the comments that have been from Tory MPs, I mean, Esther McVey at the time, why I'm quoting Esther McVey, but she did actually run for the leadership, and that is only in June. It's only been June this year we've had to go through this, and here we are facing an election. But in June, she said she was ashamed of the BBC's decision, which is an appalling thing to say about she was part of a government that made the BBC, put them in that position. And then we had a whole host of Conservative politicians saying how ashamed they were of the BBC. It was terrible. And those who believe in actually restoring the over 75 licence fee should take responsibility for it and join this afternoon in demanding that the UK government restore the funding for it. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you. I call Jeremy Balfour close for the Conservatives. Mr Balfour, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think I agree with many members who have said that this is an important debate, and I think it is an important debate. And I actually, although there will be different people voting in different ways, there has been actually quite a lot of consensus within this debate by all parties. Everyone within this chamber agrees how important the television and the TV licence and the BBC are to all the people. I know this from personal experience as having two parents who are both over 75, in fact both over 80, and may even be watching this this afternoon on the BBC Parliament channel. So TV is vitally important for all the people, and we can all agree on that. I think we can all agree that particularly for older people who struggle for different reasons to get out of their house, that it is a connection with what is going on in the world, but also as an entertainment, and can be seen as a friend and as someone who can give them company when we don't have it from other people. Now that, I think, raises lots of other questions in our mind around loneliness, but that is the fact that many speakers have picked up on today. I think there is also an agreement that we do need to protect the poorest, and particularly the poorest pensioners in society. And that is why those who are still on pension credit will get this exemption. And we have a slight inflating of this debate by Mark Griffin and others in regard to why has the so low pension credit take-up. And I think that is a really important issue to look at. He will be aware that we are looking at these issues within the Social Security Committee at the moment. And even halfway through our inquiry, there are no simple answers of why people don't take up benefits, both those that are devolved to Scotland and those that remain at Westminster. Mr Griffin.
Mark Griffiths.
I completely agree with Mr Balfour that there are no simple answers as to how we increase uptake. And why do the Conservatives feel it's appropriate to let the BBC take decisions on social security entitlements? Who qualifies for free licences? Who doesn't qualify for free licences? Surely that is the job for an expert, qualified agency within central government who have experience of administering social security benefits, not something that should be left with the BBC.
I think that is an interesting point, and if I can, with respect, we can come back to that in my closing in a few moments' time. So I do think we need to look at why are people not taking up benefits, but I'm not sure that is a relevant debate for today. Where there is disagreement amongst my party and I think the rest of the chamber is in regard to what happened back in July 2015. And I do think both the Cabinet Secretary, with respect, and others are trying to rewrite history here slightly. Lord Hall, who I've met once or twice, is no mean negotiator. He's not some kind of pussycat that simply rolls over and does what other people want him to do. Lord Hall went in to renegotiate the Charter, and he went in to get the best deal possible for the corporation, and absolutely right. And there was no criticism of this by Lord Hall or by others back in 2015. In fact, there is still those within the BBC who are saying that this is the best deal that we could get. And I think, if I could just develop this point to an end, I think for us as politicians to second guess why they made that decision and what pressure they were put under is to miss the bigger picture. That this was a decision that the BBC made in regard to that. And when Claire Baker says, and when Claire Baker says it came with no financial help, again, that is simply not true. Because part of the negotiation was to make people who watch the iPlayer have a TV licence. That gives extra income to those from the BBC. And there were other issues in regard to that to give the BBC more funding. Sure.
Cabinet Secretary.
During that period, I had numerous meetings with the BBC, including Tony Hall, because of the interest, particularly in Scotland, of our broadcasting. I am quite aware that this deal was a one-sided deal, that those issues, like the iPlayer, like the licence fee increases, should have been happening anyway. Now, we think, most of this chamber thinks that the government, the UK government, should shoulder responsibility of welfare policy. If the Scottish Conservatives think that the BBC should fund this, what services do the Scottish Conservatives think the BBC should cut to fund it? How many orchestras would the Scottish Conservatives close? Would they close BBC 2? Would they get rid of the CBBS? Because that's actually the choice that you, and sorry, Presiding Officer, that is the choice that the Scottish Government is placing in front of the BBC just now. What would the Scottish Conservatives cut to fund this policy, which should be funded by the UK Government?
Mr Balfour, that was a long intervention, so you will get time back.
You're too kind, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think there is the key issue. Unlike the Scottish Government, the Scottish Conservatives believe the BBC should be independent and not be told what to do by any political party. So that decision is not for us to make, it's a decision for the BBC to make. And if Mike Rumbles wants to stand up rather than grumbling from his seat, I will be happy to, absolutely.
I was beginning...
Mike Rumbles.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I was beginning to defer. Do you not understand what the points that we're making? Have you ever heard of the phrase, being made an offer you can't refuse?
Jeremy Balfour, you've not got time for more interventions.
Again, I feel we're undermining Lord Hall and the BBC in regard to the open negotiations that they took place and signed up to and agreed. And it's not for me to tell the BBC what to do and how to function. That is their choice to make it. Personally, I think we should maybe look at some of their salaries and their pay structure and some of the programmes that they produce, but that is their decision, not for us as politicians to tell them. To conclude with, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think there may well be some consensus on my final point. Whatever we decide to vote on tonight and whatever decisions are made, I do think that after the general election, when the next Conservative government is re-returned, it is important that the UK government, the BBC, do get round the table to have proper discussions to see how we take this forward. But ultimately, this is a BBC decision. They are accountable for it. They have to fund it. And we need to protect the most vulnerable pensioners in our society and make sure that they get the free TV licences that they deserve. Thank you very much.
I think members will look puzzled at the time, but we're hoping to bring decision time forward to 4:45. Hasn't been moved yet, so it's not happened, but that's why Cabinet Secretary, you're looking a bit bewildered there, not that you usually look bewildered. Calling Cabinet Secretary to close the debate. 9 minutes thereabouts.
Thank you, President Officer. I'd like to thank members for their contributions across the Chamber in this important debate. I think there is shared anger across the Chamber of the decision taken by the UK Government to transfer the costs of the over 75s licence fee concession to the BBC without any funding, knowing full well the BBC would be faced with cutting channels, programmes, services and jobs in order to keep the free over 75s licence fee. Responsibility for this lies fairly and squarely with the Conservative government. Maurice Corrie talked about negotiations. These are negotiations that were one-sided. Claire Baker is absolutely correct that the BBC had no choice in accepting that deal. And that is why we believe in the Scottish Government, in our response, that the licence fee should be raised for the purposes of public service broadcasting alone and should be set by a body independent of government, which should also keep the concession scheme under review. I also think the point about it being an open negotiation, I think the Conservatives said, no, this was behind closed doors and it wasn't transparent. And that was agreed cross-party in reports from the House of Lords and the House of Commons. I think it's incredible that we're left at the Scottish Conservatives are the last bastion standing in defence of what quite clearly was a mistaken UK government policy. Now, we've heard, very importantly, about how this decision will impact on older people's choices and lifestyles in detrimental ways. And we are deeply concerned about the impact on older people in our society, about isolation and loneliness. Indeed, Scotland and the Scottish Government are one of the first countries in the world to set forward a strategy to tackle social isolation and loneliness, taken forward by my colleague Christina McKelvey, the Minister for Older People and Equalities. On this issue, however, fundamentally, the BBC is a public service broadcaster. It exists to serve the public. And this decision is likely to deny older people the ability to access the services that it provides, whether that is news or entertainment. Licence fee funds should be devoted to delivering the BBC's public purposes, including showing the most creative, highest quality and distinctive output and services. And the decision will divert money which should be spent on developing new TV programmes and, importantly, supporting our creative economy. The BBC has warned about potential closures of services if it was to fund TV licences for all over 75s, and bearing the cost would actually have a direct impact on viewers and listeners in Scotland. Claire Baker, in her introductory speech, listed the equivalent value of the channels and the programmes that would be needed to be cut were the BBC to follow through on this. And that is why I think collectively there's a very strong argument to make sure that government, the UK government, whatever shape or form, takes back control, dare I say, of responsibility for this welfare policy. Many jobs in the Scottish media and creative sectors depend to a degree on BBC activity, and any across-the-board cut in service budgets would be detrimental to the sector. And I think we've also heard from many over 75s representative networks about the concerns about this. We've heard in many contributions about the charity Age UK, about their criticism of the plans and their importance of concern about how you support older people. And I think that was a point made by a number of people, including Neil Bibby lastly as well, about the BBC's plans for a specific group of people to pay support visits to over 75s with the intention of helping them understand the system. The over 75s licensed police knocking on the door of your grandparents without the skills and without the empathy and understanding that those who have worked in this sector for many, many years and encouraging people with benefits have, I think is actually very worrying indeed. And as the House of Commons Committee report put it, there remains an overall lack of clarity for the public on how the collection of the fee will be implemented. And I'd also like to draw the members' attention to Age Scotland's General Election Manifesto, highlighting this issue as one of great concern. Age Scotland say that it will make hundreds of thousands of our poorest pensioners choose between continuing to watch TV by cutting back on other essentials or giving it up altogether. And it's hard to swallow when Age Scotland also tells us, as Alison Johnson points out, that for over half of people aged 75 or over, a TV or radio is their main companion. And they also rightly point out that without a licence, these people would be breaking the law. Do we really expect licence-free vans to be patrolling the streets looking for and seeking out over 75s? It's completely and utterly unacceptable. It's evident in terms of some of the points that are made that there is a consensus about where this responsibility lies. I talked earlier about the negotiations. I was very struck by Mike Rumbles describing the deal as the Don Corleone offer, an offer you can't refuse. That's why you need an independent commission that's transparent in setting the licence fee as we go forward. Annabel Ewing described it as a shady deal and reflected that the cross-party House of Commons report described it as hasty and secretive. Indeed, it was a cynical ploy. And I think Gillian Martin really understood, I think, what the BBC were trying to do in the context of a new Conservative government coming in 2015, many of whom the members of which were really concerned about public service broadcasting, did not support public service broadcasting, and that really this move was about undermining public service broadcasting. I also think in terms of some of the contributions, I think Kenny Gibson was particularly powerful. He reminded us that the 2017 Conservative manifesto said it would maintain free TV licences of pensions. I hadn't quite heard until Claire Baker pointed out that that was apparently some cut and paste problem in terms of the actual production of a manifesto. So let that be a warning to all that are putting their manifestos together. I see Richard Leonard has joined the chamber. But Kenneth Gibson made a very important point in terms of the mean testing aspect of this, and it goes to the heart of why such a policy of over 75s having free TV licences is so important in tackling social isolation. He said, how can you means test for loneliness and social exclusion? That is why this debate is so important. It's about respect, it's about dignity for our older population who have benefited for a number of years. For 20 years, this has been an accepted form of social welfare policy. And it is only in recent years that the UK government has shirked that responsibility. So we want to make sure that the responsibility is laid fairly and squarely on the shoulders of the UK government to make sure that they understand their responsibility. If the UK government is not prepared to undo this mistake, the next round of negotiations on the TV licence fee must be carried out in a different way. And that's why I think the establishment of a new body in time for the next round of licence fee negotiations is absolutely right. We have repeatedly made our views known to the BBC and on this issue. And as I said, I was extensively involved in discussions. This was known to be on the horizon. It was one where I think the position of the BBC was completely and utterly untenable. They had to accept this or not receive the other aspects that people have talked about. I think it was a one-sided negotiation. We've expressed our views on the issue during the BBC consultation that an independent body be established, particularly around the concession. We also, as everybody will know in terms of the Scottish Government's position, we believe broadcasting should be devolved to ensure that proportionate decisions are made for the needs here. But I think in relation to this debate, members have made powerful contributions. They've set out the evidence. It's clear there's a division in this chamber, and the division is, do we see free licences for the over 75s as a welfare policy, or do we, as the Scottish Conservatives would advocate, see it as something that the BBC should take responsibility for by cutting so many channels, services, etc. I think the choices are quite clear. I think it's time that this chamber made our voice and our position clear. We need to stand up for our over 75s, stand up for public service broadcasting, and argue that the UK Government should stand up to their responsibility to fund TV licences for the over 75s.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary and members. That concludes our debate on TV licences for the over 75s. And if no member objects, I would be happy to accept a motion without notice to bring forward decision time to now. I wonder if Patrick Harvey, on behalf of the Bureau, would move such a motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much. I will now put the question. The question is that decision time be brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So we move to decision time. Can I remind members that if the amendment in the name of Rachel Hamilton is agreed, then the amendment in the name of Claire Baker will fall. So the first question is that amendment 19967.2 in the name of Rachel Hamilton, which seeks to amend motion 19967 in the name of Fiona Hislop on TV licences for the over 75s be agreed. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19967.2 in the name of Rachel Hamilton is yes 18, no 54. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 19967.1 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Fiona Hislop, be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19967.1 in the name of Claire Baker is yes 54, no 18. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. And our final question is that motion 19967 in the name of Fiona Hislop as amended on TV licences for the over 75s be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 19967 in the name of Fiona Hislop as amended is yes 54, no 18. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.